Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and Weasel is going to be running this episode, but I want to just poke in real quick and let you know about the new Red Chip Poker app. If you haven't already downloaded it, make sure to download it today. It includes all of our ranges that we've been creating over the years. This includes GTO ranges, simplified GTO ranges, and even exploitative ranges, with many more in the pipeline. Essentially, our goal is to put all of your preflop ranges right in your pocket, so you know what to open raise, 3-bet, 4-bet, and everything in between. Whether you've been playing for a long time and you feel like your preflop game is pretty well handled, but you just want to double check that you're not making any blunders, or you're a little bit newer to poker and you're like, okay, I'm not 100% sure what to play preflop, this is the app to get. Again, the GTO Poker Ranges app by Red Chip Poker. Look for it on any app store or go to redchippoker.com/app to learn more and download your copy today. And with all that said, I'm going to kick it right over to Weasel and let's start talking about PLO.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. This is Coach Weasel, and the topic of this episode is PLO Primer. We're going to be talking about PLO, and this episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast is especially for those who are thinking about making the jump from Holden to PLO, whether it's permanently or just mixing in some PLO games into the regular Holden grind. If you are already a seasoned PLO grinder, don't worry too much. We're going to be discussing some strategy for playing pot limit Omaha. So first of all, why PLO? Now there's a whole number of reasons I could give you, such as a new challenge, improving your overall poker intuition. But I'm just going to give you one very simple reason. And that is the games are softer. And if we're brutally honest, one of the reasons for this is that PLO games are less prone to the use of real-time assistance software. So as an experienced Hold'em player, I can see now the need to be very selective regarding the Hold'em games that we play online. And most poker networks online have poker bots, and a percentage of those bots are going to be bots making use of real-time assistance software. Even if we go back to 2020, there were reports of real-time assistance bots being removed from the tables in their 50s and larger. So we've seen an explosion in the last couple of years of computer assistance being used to generate very sophisticated Hold'em strategies. Now the purpose of this is not to scare you. Hold'em games online are still profitable. They will continue to be profitable for a number of years. But if you think about the state of Hold'em 5 years ago or 10 years ago, we know that this was much less of an issue. The games were softer. It was easier to generate a consistent return. Well, PLO games are still like that. There might be some PLO bots out there, but generally the way that solvers have been used to tackle pot limit Omaha is very much still in their early stages compared to the state that we've reached in 2022 with Hold'em. So if you want an easier grind, more profits, a more future-proofed variant to play, then PLO might be a good choice for you. So let's assume that we want to migrate to PLO or start incorporating more PLO into our grind. How difficult is it to actually switch between the two or completely migrate? And one of the most common complaints I hear is, I get confused when switching between PLO and Hold'em. There's this feeling that it has to be one or the other because by the time we're in PLO grind mode and thinking about the 4 cards are being dealt, it's very difficult to switch back to Hold'em. After all, the strategies we use for PLO and Hold'em are completely different, including postflop play. Or at least that's what players think. If we actually approach pot limit Omaha in the right way, we can virtually use the same strategy that we use to Hold'em. Now that's not 100% true because there are some obvious, very clear differences between the two variants. For example, the fact that we're dealt 4 cards in PLO rather than 2 cards in Hold'em. But think about all of the things that are the same between the two variants and theoretically should be approached in the same way. Think about bluff catching, for example. It's just a function of the price we get on the call and the distribution of bluff to value hands in our opponent's range. That's completely identical in Omaha to Holden. What about when we're playing as the aggressor in terms of constructing bluff to value ratios on the river? Again, it's completely identical across PLO and Holden. And many other concepts translate as well. Think about pot equity. It's the same. Think about range versus range equity. Same idea. Pot odds, implied odds. How about pot growth? The exploitative idea that if we have something that can make a very strong holding by the river, we want to start growing the pot earlier on in the hand. Whereas if we have something that's likely to make a mid-strength hand by the river, we keep the pot small. Even board textures are surprisingly similar across the two variants. The way, for example, we find that high card textures generally favor the PFR, whereas mid-range coordinated textures very often favor the preflop caller. If we have a look at range versus range equity in PLO, we see very similar trends. In other words, we can attack the same boards in PLO as we attack in Holden. A huge amount of your existing Hold'em skill set will translate directly to PLO. So if you're already a good Hold'em player, if you're already approaching Hold'em in the right way, you are already a good PLO player. Now that might be an oversimplification because there are differences, as we've mentioned. So this episode is going to be a crash course on those differences. And we're going to break it down into 3 key differences, 3 additional skills that you will have to add to your arsenal in order to excel at Pot Limit Omaha. So, first difference on our list, we're going to entitle this Nuts and Free Rolling. So in terms of post-flop play, the best way of thinking about PLO when starting is that it's a game of the nuts. The objective is to make the stone cold nuts post-flop. Many recreational players find this out the hard way, and an obvious example is the way that pocket aces are played in Hold'em versus PLO. So in Hold'em, if we 3-bet something like pocket aces pre-flop, and we flop an overpair in a cash game, 100 big blinds effective, very often that overpair is strong enough to commit the stacks with. And if our opponent has 2-pair or better, it's just a cooler. But most of the time our aces are going to be good. That's not necessarily how it works in PLO. Bare aces in PLO, not necessarily good enough to play for stacks with post-flop, because ultimately it's just a 1-pair hand. And as we've said, our objective is to make the nuts. Now, of course, if you've been playing PLO for some time, you'll understand that this is a simplification. We don't always need the stone cold nuts. It depends on the scenario. So as a quick example, river bluff catching ranges in PLO usually start around the decent 2-pair region plus, but it does depend heavily on the board texture. So if there's a possible flush, for example, then our bluff catching range is probably not going to include those 2-pair type hands. But if it's a very bricked run out, we might conceivably think about bluff catching something like top 2-pair, depending on the situation. But in terms of our post-flop stacking off objective, it's to make hands that are either the nuts or very close to it. Now to complicate this slightly further, in PLO, the nuts is not always the nuts. And this is where this very important concept of free rolling comes into play. Now we might be somewhat aware of how free rolling works in Holden, but it just doesn't really happen that much. Imagine a situation, for example, where 2 players have made the same straight, but one of them has a flush draw or a backdoor flush draw. So when the chips go in on the flop, for example, one player has slightly more equity because they have the same straight, so they're chopping, but they have a free roll, a chance to make the flush. Well, in PLO, this happens quite a lot. In fact, it happens so often that it's an important component of our strategy. And if we flop something like the nut straight without redraws, that's referred to as the bare nuts. And we have to be very careful that we're not in a situation where we get free rolled by an opponent who has the same straight as us, but also has a flush draw or a backdoor flush draw to go with their straight, or in many cases, higher straight draws available as well. So if we just think about an example of that, if we imagine the board texture is 8, 9, 10, and we have Queen Jack, so we've flopped the nut straight, don't worry about the 2 side cards, but our opponent has Queen Jack, King, Ace. Well, the problems are that any time the turn comes queen or jack, our opponent has now redrawn to the king high straight. And it might seem at first glance from a Holden context that we've just been unlucky there. We had the nuts, but our opponent just outdrew us. That's not really the case. This happens frequently enough in PLO that it's part of the strategy. It's part of the metagame. And as much as possible, we're looking to make strong hands that have that free roll component in the hopes of stacking off against our opponent who just has the bare nut version of the same hand. Let's move on to concept number 2. And this is simply going to be a discussion on adjusting to the fact that we're dealt 4 cards pre-flop instead of 2. Now in Hold'em, there's a fairly small amount of different starting combos that we can be dealt, and this allows us to document pre-flop strategies in very neat whole card grids. But seeing as there's so many starting hands in PLO, it's very difficult to document our entire strategy in a whole cards grid. In fact, what we end up having is a whole cards grid of whole cards grids, which is not something that's easy to consult. So rather than memorizing PLO strategies, it's better to have a good understanding of the mechanics of what makes a hand strong in a certain scenario. Now, if we start with the very basics, we must use exactly 2 of our whole cards. Not 1, not 3, but exactly 2. And it's almost a rite of passage for new players that at some point there's going to be 4 hearts on the board. They have the naked ace of hearts in their holding, and then they assume that they have the ace high flush, because that's how it works in Holden. If there's 4 hearts on the board and we have the ace of hearts in the hole, we have the ace high flush. Not in PLO, because we have to use exactly 2 of our whole cards. So we can only use 3 of the hearts from the board. If we only have 1 heart in the hole, we don't have a flush. We only have 4 cards to the flush, which is otherwise known as ace high. This creates some other interesting implications. For example, in Hold'em, when the 4th card to a flush hits on the river, that's quite a unique situation because we know that any player who has one of the suited cards in the hole now has the flush. In PLO, it's different because when that 4th card to the flush hits the river, it doesn't actually complete any additional flushes that weren't already existing. And it now makes it less likely that someone has a flush because there's an extra card that's on the board that can't therefore be part of our opponent's whole cards. In terms of pre-flop hand selection, keep in mind that the positions in PLO are exactly the same as Hold'em. That means we're going to be doing things like stealing very aggressively from the button and the small blind. It means we're going to be cold calling wide from the big blind, but not so much from other positions. And it also means that we want a completing range in the small blind if it's folded around to us pre-flop. In terms of the earlier positions, the further back we go in position, the tighter we're going to be open raising. So in the earliest position, UTG on a 6 max table, we want all 4 of our cards to be working well together. So something that's strong in Hold'em is not necessarily strong in PLO. So if we have ace king and 2 ragged side cards in UTG and PLO, that's not a good starting hand. It doesn't matter that we have ace king offsuit as part of our whole cards. We're dealt 4 cards, we need all 4 cards to coordinate. Now we can loosen up the requirements as we get to late position. So we might find that we can steal on the button if we just have very good 2 card coordination. But for the earlier positions, we want 4 or 3 card coordination in order to be able to open raise. When we think about the strength of a hand, we're thinking about suitedness. So the best possible iteration of that is double suited in PLO. And if we have 3 or 4 cards to a suit, that's a bad thing. If we have 4 diamonds, that's bad because we can only use 2 of them, but the other 2 diamonds actually remove or block our possible flush draw outs. Connectedness and nuttiness. So connectedness is like suited connectors in Hold'em, but rather than 2 cards of consecutive rank, we actually want 3 or 4 cards of consecutive rank in PLO. For example, we have something like 10-9-8-7. So that's like the equivalent of a premium suited connector in PLO. And these types of hands are referred to as rundowns. So for example, 10-9-8-7 is referred to as a 10 high rundown. Nuttiness refers to a hand's ability to make the nuts. So we generally like hands in PLO that are suited to the ace or have fairly high cards in them because they're more likely to make the nut flush or the nut straight as a result. Now there's quite a lot to think about here. It can be very confusing at first. So if we were to really simplify this, the most important component of your PLO hand is how many high cards you have. So we'll find, for example, that if we have 4 cards 9 or higher, it's nearly always playable. Obviously, it would be preferable that it's double suited or even single suited, but even if it's rainbow, that can sometimes be a playable hand because something like Ace, King, Queen, 10, for example, has very good ability to make the Broadway straight post flop. This is true for paired hands as well. Something like Ace, Ace, Jack, Jack is nearly always going to be playable, even if it's actually a rainbow combo and not suited to any of the aces. So if in doubt, start by thinking about the number of high cards we have in our hand, and think about suitedness, double suitedness, connectedness as a bonus. Now just a quick word on how rundowns work. Rundowns are obviously very good because they can make the nut straight post-flop. And we break down rundowns a little bit further in terms of how many gaps they have. So 10-9-8-7 is referred to as a 10 high rundown. If we had something like 10-8-7-6, notice there's a gap in the top of that structure. So we describe that as a 10 high rundown top gap. If we had something like 10-9-8-6, we would describe that as a 10 high rundown bottom gap. As a really general guide, if we're going to have gaps, and we don't like gaps, they actually weaken the strength of the rundown, we prefer the gaps to be lower in the structure. So 10-9-8-6 is a stronger hand than 10-8-7-6, because 10-8-7-6 has top gap. And when we have top gap in our rundown, it increases the likelihood that we're going to be flopping dominated straights or dominated straight draws post flop. And as we described earlier, PLO is the game of the nuts, so having dominated straights can sometimes be a big headache in PLO. One final term you'll hear discussed is polar versus smooth, and this is an especially useful concept if we're getting involved in lots of multi-way pots. So a smooth hand is something that can hit the flop in a variety of different ways. So for example, a 10 high double suited rundown. It won't necessarily make nut flushes, but it can make some nut straights. But it very often connects with the board in some kind of way. It's going to have some kind of straight draw, some kind of flush draw, backdoor flush draw. We describe this as smooth equity. A polar hand is something that does one thing very well, but does also just miss a lot of flops. And polar hands are very good for playing multi-way. So for example, if we just had something like Ace 5 of diamonds and 2 ragged side cards, that could do pretty well in a 6-way pot. Because if it does make the nut flush, it's going to be good enough to stack off against anyone with because it's going to be the nuts. But if we have that same hand in a heads-up situation, we kind of have a problem because most of the time we're going to miss the flop and our opponent's going to be able to push us off our holding. So in heads-up scenarios, we potentially prefer smoother equity. Let's move on to our third concept, or our third difference between PLO and Hold'em. And that's being able to enumerate the big straight draws in PLO. Any straight draw with more than 8 outs is referred to as a wrap. So basically any straight draw that can't exist in Hold'em because we only have 2 cards, but can exist in PLO. We can make wraps using 3 of our PLO hole cards or 4 of our PLO hole cards. And just to give you some numbers, like in Hold'em where our most common straight draws are the 4-out gut shot or the 8-out OESD. In fact, those are the only draws we can have. In PLO, the most common big straight draws, the most common wraps are as follows. So with 3 cards, we can make the 9-out wrap, the 13-out wrap, and the 17-out wrap. But keep in mind that that 17-out wrap made with 3 cards can never have all of its outs nutted. It's going to have a decent chunk of non-nut outs, perhaps 11 or so, for example. With 4 cards, we can make the 16-out nut wrap. So that means that all 16 outs are to the nuts. And nutted outs are very important when we're thinking about wraps. It's presumably much better to have a 16-out nut wrap where all of the outs are to the nuts, as opposed to having a 17-out wrap where only 11 of the outs are to the nuts. It's even possible to make a 20-out wrap using 4 of our hole cards. It requires a very specific board texture though. It requires a board texture with a double gap, such as 10-7-4 and we hold 5-6-8-9. That would be the 20 out wrap. It's nicknamed the main to Spain wrap, but only 14 of the 20 outs are actually to the nuts. So again, is it better to have a 20 out wrap with only 14 nut outs? Or is it better to have a 4 card 16 out wrap where all of the outs are to the nuts? In most cases, it's going to be the latter because dominated straights are a big problem in PLO. Now, just to give you a shortcut for being able to recognize wraps quickly and understand what our outs are. Imagine a situation where the board texture comes down 8-9x and we have Queen Jack 10x in the hole. Now, we don't actually have a straight here because we can only use 2 of our hole cards. But if we were hypothetically allowed to use 3 of our hole cards, now we'd already have a made straight. We can refer to this as a fake straight. So we have all 5 cards between 8 and queen, but because of the 2 card only PLO rule, we don't actually have a straight yet. Now in those situations where we have a fake straight, any of the cards in our hand that contribute to that fake straight are also outs to complete the wrap. So we have Queen Jack 10 in the hole, any Queen, Jack, or 10 is an out, and there's going to be 3 of each of them because we obviously block one of the 4 cards of that rank since we have it in the hole. Of course, that's not all of the outs enumerated because in this case, the 7 would also complete the Jack high straight for us. And since we don't have the 7 in the hole, there's actually 4 clean 7 outs in the deck. So we've got 3, 6, 9, plus 4, 13 outs. This is an example of the 3 card 13 out nut wrap. Another really simple pattern to recognize is notice how our 3 hole cards that formulate the wrap are on top of the board. They're all higher ranked than the highest card on the board. If we instead had the 3 cards below the board, so instead of Queen Jack 10x, we actually have 5, 6, 7x on the 9, 8x board, we still have a 3 card 13 out wrap, but it's no longer the nut wrap because we're now below the board. Despite having 13 outs, this particular wrap only has 3 nut outs. It's a big danger hand in PLO. As you get used to spotting different types of wraps, you'll begin to see the pattern. So for example, in Holden, you've probably already reached the stage where if you flop a gut shot or an OESD, you just know. You don't have to take that extra 10 seconds out to think about how many outs do I have in this spot. You just know, okay, I flopped an OESD. Okay, I flopped a gut shot. It's going to take a bit longer with PLO, but you'll get to the stage where as soon as you flop Queen Jack 10x on the 8-9x, you just know, okay, that's 13 out nut wrap. You just know. So it takes some time, but that's the level of understanding you want to reach because you don't want to spend valuable game time thinking about how many outs you have rather than the strategy you want to employ in that hand. Just to finish off, keep in mind that if you do make the decision to experiment with PLO, you're going to be opening up a lot of additional doors for yourself. For example, 5 card PLO is currently trending. There's a lot of traffic, and I'm guessing there's probably close to 0 bots, and there's hardly any solver analysis that's been run on this game. Even 6 card PLO games are running online. They may be not as popular as 5 card PLO, but as 5 card PLO gets tougher, maybe more and more players will be migrating to the 6 card PLO games, which are very, very soft right now at this moment in time. And the cool thing is you don't really need a lot of extra knowledge to migrate from 4 card PLO to 5 card PLO, or from 5 card PLO to 6 card PLO. Many of the concepts are completely identical across all 3 of these variants. So if you're looking for a game that has fairly good traffic, doesn't suffer from an influx of bots, doesn't suffer from large amounts of players using solver approved strategies, if you want to grind and make big returns like in the earlier days of poker, well, this is why you have Pot Limit Omaha. It's there, it's available. So take a moment to think about whether it's a good idea to make the migration or incorporate more PLO games into your current grind. Thanks for listening, guys. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.